1.4 million. Say that number out loud, not as a statistic, not as a data point in a research report that gets cited once and forgotten, as a number attached to human beings, men who had names, men who had families, men who had addresses in Russian cities and towns and villages that are now missing someone who is not coming back, 1.4 million of them, killed, wounded, or missing in a war that the Kremlin told its own generals would be finished in 10 days. 10 days became 10 weeks, 10 weeks became 10 months, 10 months became 4 years. And somewhere along the way, the number that was never supposed to get this large quietly crossed 1.4 million and kept climbing. But here is the part that should actually stop you, not the size of the number, the direction it is pointing. Because Russia has crossed a line in 2026 that it spent 4 years desperately trying not to cross. It is now losing soldiers faster than it can find new ones to replace them. And when that arithmetic flips, when the subtraction starts running faster than the addition, everything sitting downstream of it starts moving in a direction that no amount of state television coverage and no amount of Kremlin messaging can stop or slow down or paint over. That is what tonight is about: the number, the direction, and what happens next. Section 1. The honest truth, 045 to 330. This is not a casualty report. This is an autopsy of a strategy that failed. Let us start with where this number came from, because the source matters as much as the figure itself in a war this saturated with claims from every direction. The 1.4 million figure comes from a report published in the first week of July 2026 by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. CSIS is a bipartisan research organization based in Washington. It is not a Ukrainian government publication. It is not a NATO press release. It is not a think tank with a financial interest in one side of this conflict winning. It is one of the most respected defense and foreign policy research institutions in the United States, and its authors, Seth Jones and Riley McCabe, are the kind of analysts who build careers on precision and lose credibility the moment they inflate a number for effect. The report is titled Russian Blood and Treasure, and the authors did not pick that title to be dramatic. They picked it because both things are running out at the same time, and understanding why they are running out together is the entire key to understanding what this report actually tells us about where this war is heading. Start with the blood, because that is what the number demands. 1.4 million total casualties since February of 2022. That figure breaks down into 3 categories, and each category tells a different part of the story. Killed in action, wounded seriously enough to be removed from combat, and missing, which in the context of this war means a combination of prisoners, men whose fate has not been officially confirmed, and in many cases men who died in circumstances that the Russian military has not formally acknowledged. Of that 1.4 million total, somewhere around 450,000 are dead, not wounded, not missing, dead. Now translate that number into something you can actually hold in your mind, because 450,000 is the kind of figure that is large enough to become abstract if you let it. 450,000 is roughly the entire population of a mid-sized American city. It is more than the total number of American military deaths in the Second World War. It is a number that represents not just a military cost, but a generational cost. These are men predominantly between the ages of 18 and 45. The working age, family-raising, economically productive generation of Russian society. And they are gone in a volume and at a pace that Russia has not experienced since the Second World War itself. The wounded figure sitting behind that death toll is even larger. Serious combat wounds in modern warfare typically outnumber deaths by a ratio of somewhere between 2 and 4 to 1, depending on the conflict, the medical infrastructure available, and the nature of the weapons being used. In Ukraine, that ratio has been complicated by the drone warfare environment, which produces a specific pattern of injuries, blast injuries, fragmentation injuries, burns, that are survivable with immediate medical care, but that frequently result in permanent disability rather than full recovery. Which means that the wounded portion of Russia's 1.4 million is not a pool of men who will heal and return to the front. It is a pool of men who are out of this war permanently and who will require long-term medical and social support from a Russian state that is simultaneously trying to fund a war, manage sanctions, and hold together an economy under enormous external pressure. Now come to the part that the CSIS report emphasized most strongly, because it is the part that changes the strategic picture more than any single battle or territorial shift has managed to change it. Russia has crossed the recruitment threshold. What that means in plain language is this. For the first 4 years of this war, Russia was able to maintain its force levels through a combination of volunteer recruitment, financial incentives that made military service attractive to men from Russia's poorer regions, prisoner recruitment, and a mobilization effort that avoided the word mobilization in public while functioning as one in practice. The system was ugly and expensive, and it generated its own political and social tensions. but it worked well enough to keep replacing the losses at roughly the rate they were occurring. That system is no longer keeping up. The losses in 2025 and into 2026 have been running at a pace that the recruitment pipeline cannot match. Russia is now in a position where the number of men leaving the front line through death or serious injury is consistently larger than the number of men arriving to replace them. That gap is not enormous yet. It is not the kind of catastrophic shortfall that collapses a front line overnight. But it is real. It is measurable. It is confirmed by the CSIS report and by independent analysis from multiple other research organizations that have been tracking Russian force generation throughout this conflict. And it is the kind of gap that does not close by itself. It only closes if Russia does one of two things. It either finds a way to dramatically increase recruitment, which means either a formal mass mobilization that carries enormous domestic political risk for Putin, or a financial incentive so large that it strains a budget already under severe pressure, or it reduces its losses, which means pulling back from the offensive posture that has been grinding through eastern Ukraine at enormous human cost, and accepting a defensive line that trades territory for soldiers. Neither of those options is good for Putin, and neither of them is what his 2026 strategy was supposed to require. Because the strategy was supposed to be simpler than this. The strategy was supposed to be outlast, grind, and wait. And the 1.4 million figure is the clearest possible evidence that the grinding is costing Russia more than the waiting is costing the West. Every war has a theory, not just a military theory, a political theory. A story the side starting the war tells itself about how this ends in a way that looks like winning. And Russia's theory for this war was never really about taking every city in Ukraine, or planting a flag in Kiev, or destroying the Ukrainian state completely. Those were the opening ambitions of February 2022, and they died within the first month when the columns turned back from the capital, and the 10-day plan revealed itself to be a fantasy built on assumptions that collapsed on first contact with reality. After that first month, Russia rebuilt its theory, and the rebuilt theory was elegant in its simplicity. It went like this: Ukraine cannot win a long war against Russia because Russia is bigger, has more people, has more resources, and has a higher tolerance for casualties than a Western-backed smaller nation fighting for survival can sustain indefinitely. The West will eventually get tired of paying for Ukraine's defense. The political will in Washington and Brussels and Berlin will soften as the bills get larger and the battlefield results stay inconclusive. And when that political will softens enough, Ukraine will have to negotiate. And when Ukraine negotiates from exhaustion rather than strength, Russia gets to define what the settlement looks like. That theory required one thing above everything else to work. Russia had to still be standing when the West got tired. 1.4 million casualties is the report card on whether that requirement is being met. Let us walk through what those casualties are actually doing to the machine that was supposed to outlast everybody else in this conflict. Because the damage is not happening in one place. It is happening in 5 places simultaneously, and the interaction between those 5 pressure points is what makes the CSIS report titled Russian Blood and Treasure so significant as a document. Start with the budget because money is the fuel that keeps every other system running. Russia entered this war with substantial financial reserves built up over years of oil revenue and careful fiscal management. The Reserve Fund and the National Wealth Fund gave Russia a cushion that allowed it to absorb the initial shock of Western sanctions without the immediate economic collapse that many analysts predicted in early 2022. That cushion is not gone, but it is significantly smaller than it was, and the rate at which it is being consumed has accelerated as the war has extended and as the cost of replacing casualties has grown alongside the cost of replacing equipment. Here is the specific financial pressure that 1.4 million casualties creates that does not show up in the headline number. Every Russian soldier killed generates a death payment to his family. The Russian government has set those payments at levels designed to make military service financially attractive in the regions where recruitment has been heaviest. Regions where the monthly military salary represents multiple times what a civilian job would pay, and where the death payment represents more money than a family might otherwise see in a decade. Those payments are not optional. They are contractual obligations that the Russian state made to recruit the men it needed, and at 450,000 dead, the cumulative payout on those obligations represents a budget line that was not in any financial projection made before February of 2022. Add the cost of serious wounds. Wounded soldiers who cannot return to duty still generate ongoing pension and disability payments. The medical infrastructure required to treat the volume of casualties Russia has been absorbing has required significant investment in field hospitals, evacuation systems, and rear area medical facilities that were not built for a war of this scale and duration. The treasure half of the CSIS report title is not a metaphor. It is a running tally of financial obligations that compound every single week the war continues at its current intensity. Now move to the ruble, because the currency tells you things the official budget numbers do not. The ruble has been under persistent pressure throughout this conflict. Russia has managed that pressure through capital controls, through energy export revenue, and through the kind of financial engineering that keeps a number stable on a screen while the underlying economy moves in a different direction. But the combination of sanctions, reduced oil revenue from the refinery damage we covered in the last section, and the expanding budget obligations created by 1.4 million casualties is creating a financial pressure that currency management tools can slow but cannot stop indefinitely. Ordinary Russians are feeling this. Not through the ruble number on a financial screen, through the price of groceries, through the cost of imported goods that used to be cheap and are now either unavailable or expensive, through the interest rates that the Russian central bank has had to maintain at levels that make borrowing for businesses and ordinary citizens crushingly expensive in order to prevent inflation from becoming the kind of visible, daily, impossible-to-ignore problem that erodes public support faster than any battlefield defeat. Now connect this to the recruitment crisis we talked about in the previous section because the financial and the human dimensions of this problem are feeding each other in a loop that gets harder to break the longer it runs. Russia needs to recruit more soldiers to replace the 1.4 million it has lost. To recruit more soldiers, it needs to offer financial incentives large enough to overcome the growing awareness among Russian men of military age that signing up carries a very real chance of ending up in one of those three categories: killed, seriously wounded, missing. The incentives required to recruit into a war with that kind of visible casualty rate are larger than the incentives required to recruit into a war that looks like it is going well, which means the financial cost of each new recruit is higher than it was in 2022 or 2023, which means the budget pressure from recruitment adds to the budget pressure from death payments and disability pensions and medical infrastructure at exactly the moment when oil revenue is under pressure from refinery damage and sanctions enforcement. That is the loop. And Putin's hope for 2026 was that none of this would matter because the West would crack first. His hope was that somewhere in the American political system, or in the German election cycle, or in the French budget debates, or in the British public opinion numbers, a door would open wide enough for Russia to walk through to a negotiating table on favorable terms. His hope was that the pain Russia was absorbing would turn out to be less than the pain the Western alliance was absorbing in political will and financial commitment and public patience. That hope is not dead tonight. But it is bleeding from 1.4 million wounds, because the CSIS report did not just count the casualties, it counted the cost. And the cost is running at a rate that the original theory of this war, the outlast and grind and wait theory, did not account for surviving all the way to the summer of 2026 still paying in full. Ukraine did not end Putin's hopes with a single battle. It ended them the way water ends a stone, slowly, consistently, one casualty at a time. Until the theory that was supposed to win this war started looking like the most expensive failed prediction in modern military history. The war Russia thought it was winning is eating the country that started it. There is a moment in every long war when the country fighting it stops arguing about whether it is winning and starts arguing about whether it can survive continuing. Russia has not reached that moment yet. But for the first time since February of 2022, serious analysts inside and outside of Russia are asking the question that nobody was asking in the early years of this conflict. Not can Russia win, not can Russia hold its gains, but can Russia absorb what this war is costing it without something breaking inside the country itself? And the answer that the CSIS report is pointing toward, the answer that 1.4 million casualties in 4 years of financial bleeding and a recruitment crisis and a fuel shortage and a ruble under permanent pressure are collectively suggesting is that the breaking point is no longer a theoretical future possibility. It is a direction. And the direction is becoming clearer every month that this war continues at its current cost. Let us talk about what that direction actually leads to, because this is the part of the story that goes beyond the battlefield and into something that will shape Russia and Europe and the global security picture for a generation after the last shot in Ukraine is fired. Start with the political dimension inside Russia, because it is the one that Putin has the most direct control over, and therefore the one he is most focused on managing right now. The 1.4 million casualty figure is not being reported honestly inside Russia. State television does not run the CSIS numbers. Russian official casualty figures are a fraction of what independent research organizations and Western intelligence assessments have consistently produced throughout this conflict. The gap between what ordinary Russians are told about the human cost of this war and what the human cost actually is has been one of the most carefully managed aspects of the entire Kremlin information operation since February of 2022. But information management has a ceiling, and that ceiling is the lived experience of ordinary Russian families. You cannot tell a mother in Volgograd that the war is going well when her son came home in a zinc coffin. You cannot tell a wife in Yekaterinburg that casualties are minimal when her husband has been missing for 8 months, and the military cannot give her a clear answer about where he is or what happened to him. You cannot tell a community in Dagestan or Buryatia or any of the other regions that have contributed disproportionately to Russia's casualty figures that the sacrifice is worth it when the coffins keep arriving and the promised victory keeps receding into a future that never quite arrives. The Russian government knows this, which is why the domestic political management of 1.4 million casualties is one of the most complex and resource-intensive operations the Kremlin is running simultaneously alongside the actual war. It requires constant messaging. It requires the suppression of independent journalism and social media content that would allow Russians to compare notes on what they are experiencing in their communities. It requires the criminalization of public dissent in a way that makes the cost of speaking honestly about what the war is doing to Russian families higher than the cost of staying quiet. That system is working, but it is working under increasing strain, because the strain is not coming from organized political opposition. Organized opposition inside Russia has been effectively dismantled. The strain is coming from something much harder to suppress. It is coming from arithmetic. From the simple, daily, impossible to fully hide reality that the men are not coming back at the rate the state television narrative requires them to come back from in order for the story of a successful and worthwhile military operation to remain believable to the people living inside it. Now move to the military dimension because the political and military pressures are feeding each other in ways that limit Putin's options in both directions simultaneously. The recruitment crisis we established in the previous sections is not just a number on a spreadsheet, it is showing up in the quality of the forces Russia is deploying. The experienced soldiers, the men who had real military training before February of 2022, the professional core of the Russian military that gave it genuine capability in the early phases of the conflict. That core has been consumed by 4 years of grinding combat at a rate that training programs cannot replace on any reasonable timeline. What Russia is putting into the field in 2026 is increasingly composed of men who received weeks of training rather than years, men who were recruited from prisons with criminal records rather than military backgrounds, men from regions with limited Russian language proficiency being commanded by officers who cannot communicate with them effectively under combat stress. The tactical quality of Russian infantry has been declining measurably for the past 2 years, and the casualty figures are the primary reason why. This matters on the battlefield in ways that are difficult to see in the daily territorial maps, but that show up in operational outcomes over time. Russia is still advancing in places. The sheer weight of artillery and the willingness to absorb casualties to gain small amounts of ground is still producing incremental territorial changes in parts of eastern Ukraine. But the pace of those advances has slowed compared to what Russian force was achieving in 2024. The cost per kilometer of advance has increased. The ability to exploit local breakthroughs and turn them into operational level gains has diminished as the experienced maneuver force that would be needed to exploit those breakthroughs has been ground down and not adequately replaced. Ukraine has noticed this, and Ukraine's strategic response to it has been to deliberately target the sustainability of Russian operations rather than trying to match Russian mass with Ukrainian mass. The drone campaign against fuel infrastructure that we covered earlier in this video is part of that strategy. The targeting of Russian command and control nodes, logistics hubs, ammunition depots, and officer concentrations is part of that strategy. Ukraine is not trying to out-attrit Russia in a straight exchange of casualties. Ukraine is trying to make each Russian casualty more expensive and harder to replace than the last one, while simultaneously making Ukrainian casualties cheaper and more replaceable through better training, better equipment, and better tactical adaptation. That asymmetry is what the 1.4 million figure is really measuring. Not just how many Russians have been lost, but how much harder it is getting for Russia to replace each one compared to how much easier it is getting for Ukraine to sustain its own force. Now zoom out to the international dimension because the casualty figures do not exist in isolation from the broader pressure environment that Russia is navigating in the summer of 2026. The CSIS report landing in the first week of July is not an accident of timing. It lands in a period when Western governments are making decisions about continued military and financial support for Ukraine. It lands when the argument about whether Ukraine can actually win, or whether the West should push for a negotiated settlement, is being had loudly in capitals across Europe and North America. And it lands with a specific message aimed at that argument. The message is this: Russia is not the side with infinite capacity to absorb this war. Russia is the side with 1.4 million casualties, a recruitment crisis, a fuel shortage, a budget under pressure, and a domestic information management operation that is running at maximum capacity to prevent ordinary Russians from understanding the full cost of what their government started in February of 2022. The side that is running out of things is not Ukraine. It is the country that thought it would win in 10 days. And the hopes that Putin carried into 2026, the hope that the West would crack, the hope that Ukraine would exhaust, the hope that time was on Russia's side, those hopes are not being ended by a single Ukrainian victory on the battlefield. They are being ended by 1.4 million data points that all point in the same direction, away from the future Putin planned for, and toward something Russia has not had to seriously confront since the Soviet Union collapsed. The possibility that the war it started cannot be won at any price Russia is actually capable of paying. 1.4 million reasons. The war Russia started is not the war Russia is fighting anymore. Come back to the number, not as a statistic sitting in a Washington research report, not as a data point in an analyst's presentation, not as a figure that scrolled past you on a news feed and disappeared into the noise of everything else competing for your attention on a Tuesday morning in July of 2026, as a direction. Because that is what we said at the very beginning of this video, and that is what everything we have walked through together since then has been building toward. The part that should stop you is not the size of the number, it is the direction it is pointing. And after everything we have covered tonight, after the recruitment arithmetic and the budget pressure and the ruble and the fuel shortage and the quality decline in Russian forces and the domestic information management operation running at maximum capacity to keep ordinary Russians from understanding what this war is actually costing them, the direction is not ambiguous anymore. It is pointing at a Russia that is not winning this war, not losing it dramatically, not collapsing overnight, not experiencing the kind of sudden, catastrophic failure that makes for clean television coverage and simple headlines, but losing it in the way that actually matters, losing it structurally, losing it in the balance sheet and the recruitment office and the refinery and the zinc coffin arriving in a provincial city and the mother who is not going to believe the state television version of why her son is not coming home. That is the direction 1.4 million is pointing, and no amount of Kremlin messaging changes the arithmetic underneath it. Here is what the three scenarios look like from where we are standing in the summer of 2026, because a number this significant does not resolve itself in a single direction, and the path this war takes from here is genuinely uncertain in ways that matter for everyone watching it from the outside. The first scenario is the one Ukraine and its supporters are working toward and that the CSIS report is implicitly arguing for. The pressure compounds. The 1.4 million becomes 1.5 million and then 1.6 million at a pace that the recruitment pipeline cannot keep up with. The fuel shortage that we covered earlier deepens as the refinery campaign continues and the budget pressure from death payments and disability pensions and military salaries and equipment replacement all pull on the same shrinking pool of resources simultaneously. The domestic information management operation starts showing cracks, not because organized opposition emerges, but because the arithmetic of kitchen table reality, the price of groceries, the missing son, the empty pump, the declining ruble, becomes impossible to fully explain away with state television narratives that require less and less contact with lived experience to sustain. In this scenario, Russia does not collapse, but it reaches a point where the cost of continuing the war at its current intensity exceeds what the political system can absorb without formal mass mobilization. And formal mass mobilization is the one decision Putin has spent 4 years avoiding because he understands what it does to the domestic political compact that keeps him in power. The quiet that he has been selling ordinary Russians, the implicit promise that this war can be fought by volunteers and contractors and recruited prisoners without disrupting the daily lives of the urban middle class that forms the social base of Kremlin stability, that quiet ends the moment mobilization is declared, and what comes after that quiet is something Putin cannot fully control or predict. The second scenario is the one Russian military planners are hoping for and working toward. Russia finds a way to stabilize the recruitment gap without formal mobilization. It deepens its military partnerships with countries willing to provide manpower, equipment, and financial support regardless of Western pressure. It finds workarounds for the fuel shortage and the budget pressure that are expensive and inefficient but functional enough to keep the front line from collapsing. And it bets that somewhere in the Western political calendar, in an American election cycle, or a European budget crisis, or a shift in public opinion driven by economic fatigue, the support for Ukraine softens enough to open the negotiating window that the whole theory of this war has been waiting for. This scenario is not impossible. It requires a lot of things to go right for Russia simultaneously. It requires the recruitment workarounds to work faster than the casualty rate is growing. It requires the Western political will to crack before the Russian economic model does. It requires Putin to manage the domestic pressure from 1.4 million casualties without the information management operation failing in a way that changes the political calculation inside Russia. None of those things are guaranteed, but none of them are impossible either. The third scenario is the one that serious analysts are most reluctant to talk about publicly because it involves a Russia that decides the pressure it is under is intolerable and responds not by moderating its behavior, but by escalating in ways designed to change the terms of the conflict entirely. A Russia that looks at 1.4 million casualties and a fuel shortage and a recruitment crisis and a budget under pressure, and concludes that the only way to change the direction of all those arrows is to do something that forces the West to choose between escalating with Russia directly or accepting a Russian-defined outcome in Ukraine. This scenario carries the highest risk of the three. It is also not impossible given what we know about how authoritarian governments respond to existential pressure. The history of this war has been a history of predictions that underestimated Ukrainian resilience and overestimated Russian capacity. Every analyst who said Ukraine would fall in days was wrong. Every analyst who said Russia would be economically collapsed by sanctions within months was wrong. Every analyst who said the 2023 Ukrainian counteroffensive would break Russian lines was wrong. Certainty has not served this conflict well. What the CSIS report gives us is not certainty. It gives us a measurement. 1.4 million is a measurement of what 4 years of this war has cost the country that started it. It is a measurement taken by serious people at a serious institution using the best available data. And what it measures points in a direction that Putin's theory of this war did not account for surviving all the way to the summer of 2026, still paying in full. Come back one final time to February of 2022. 10 days. That was the plan. 10 days, and it would be over. The flags would be up. The government would be replaced. The West would protest and then accept the new reality. And Russia would have demonstrated once and for all that the post-Cold War security architecture of Europe could be rewritten by force. 4 years and 4 months later, the flags are not up. The government was not replaced. The West did not accept the new reality. And the country that was supposed to fold in 10 days has instead handed the country that attacked it 1.4 million casualties, a fuel crisis, a recruitment emergency, a budget under pressure, and a domestic information operation running at maximum capacity to prevent ordinary Russians from doing the math that the CSIS report just did in public. Ukraine did not end Putin's hopes with a single moment. It ended them the way this war has always actually worked, one day at a time, one drone at a time, one refinery at a time, one casualty at a time, until the number got large enough that even Washington felt it needed to be counted out loud. 1.4 million. That is not just a casualty figure. That is the answer to 10 days.